Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something enormous. Something that stretches across centuries, across oceans, across the entire foundation of what this country became. Tonight, we're telling the entire story of slavery in America. Not the version they squeezed into a single chapter of your history textbook between the Boston Tea Party and the invention of the light bulb. Not the version that starts with Abraham Lincoln looking noble on a marble chair and ends with a grateful nation learning its lesson over the course of a single paragraph. The real version, the one that begins in the belly of a wooden ship, winds through cotton fields and auction blocks and the halls of Congress, and doesn't end where you think it does. This is a story about money and power and the deliberate, methodical construction of a system so profitable that an entire civilization decided to look the other way, while human beings were worked to death under an open sky. But it's also a story about survival, about people who built families in chains, who sang freedom into existence before they could speak it aloud, who fought back in ways both spectacular and quiet, and everything in between. It is a story that demands your full attention and your deepest respect. And tonight, we're giving it both. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing the map of who's still wide awake and who's already halfway to dreamland. And tell me this, what's the one thing about slavery in America that you wish more people knew? The one detail, the one truth that gets left out of every classroom and every documentary? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and your answers always teach me something too. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Pull the covers all the way up. Get settled, because tonight we're going all the way back to the beginning, and we are not coming up for air until we've walked every single mile of this story together. Some of it is going to hurt. Some of it is going to make you angry. Some of it is going to astonish you. But all of it matters. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered what the first enslaved Africans in America actually experienced when they set foot on this soil? Not the textbook version with the neat timeline and the sanitized vocabulary, but the raw sensory reality of it. What did the air smell like? What language was being shouted at you that you couldn't understand? What happened to your name? The one your mother whispered over you when you were born, the one that connected you to your ancestors and your homeland and everything you were. Have you ever thought about how a human being gets legally transformed into a piece of property, and what that transformation actually required, not just on paper, but in the minds of everyone participating? Did you know that slavery wasn't simply a southern institution, that northern banks underwrote the loans that built the plantations? Northern ships carried the human cargo across the Atlantic, and northern mills processed the cotton that made the whole enterprise profitable. What did resistance actually look like when the cost of failure was having your toes cut off? And how did 4 million people emerge from bondage into a nation that had absolutely no interest in treating them as equal? Congratulations. You've just woken up somewhere along the West African coast. The year is 1619. You don't know it yet, but the next 246 years are about to reshape an entire continent, construct the wealthiest nation on earth, and do it all on your back. Let's begin. The air is thick and saturated, the kind of humidity that sits on your skin like a second set of clothing you didn't ask for and can't remove. You can smell salt from the ocean, maybe half a mile to the west, carried on a wind that also brings the smoke of cooking fires and the rich, dark scent of earth after rain. Somewhere behind you, Birds you've known your entire life are calling from the treetops in a language you understand better than the one being barked at you now. This is home. Or it was, until a few days ago. Maybe you were captured in a raid by a neighboring group that had entered into a trade relationship with the Europeans, who've been setting up operations along the coast. Maybe you were taken as a prisoner during a conflict and sold to middlemen who specialized in moving captives toward the shore. Maybe you were simply walking a familiar path, the one between your village and the river, and the world ended between one step and the next. The specifics vary. They always vary. But the destination doesn't. You're being marched toward the coast, toward a place that earlier captives described only in whispers. The door of no return. The march itself could last weeks. You're connected to other captives by ropes or chains at the wrist or the neck. A human chain winding through forest and across rivers and over rough terrain that shreds your feet. The traders driving you forward are interested in one thing only: delivering you to the coast alive enough to sell. Some captives collapse from exhaustion or disease and are abandoned where they fall. Others try to flee and are beaten or killed as examples. The death rate on these forced marches was significant, though no one was keeping careful records of people who died before they became someone else's inventory. You arrive at a coastal fortress. Cape Coast Castle, perhaps, or Elmina, or one of the dozens of stone fortifications that line the West African shore from present-day Senegal to Angola. These aren't crude encampments thrown together with scrap lumber. These are European-engineered structures, built with the same architectural seriousness as a cathedral or a central bank. Portuguese first, then Dutch, then English, then French, each nation flying a different banner, but running an identical operation underneath it. Above you, in the upper floors of the castle, European traders occupy furnished apartments. They eat imported food, drink wine shipped from Lisbon or Amsterdam, write letters home about the weather and the trading conditions and the difficulty of keeping the books balanced. One floor below them sits a chapel where the garrison attends Sunday services. And beneath all of that, in the stone dungeons carved into the foundation, hundreds of human beings are packed into chambers with no ventilation, no sanitation, no light, and barely enough room to sit down. The floor is slick with waste that has accumulated over weeks and months because these dungeons are never fully emptied. The air is so dense with the smell of sickness and decay and fear that newcomers sometimes pass out from the shock of breathing it. This is where you wait. Days, weeks, sometimes months, until a ship arrives in the harbour and the next phase of your destruction begins. Here's the thing about the transatlantic slave trade that gets swallowed by the enormity of the numbers. 12 million Africans forced onto ships over the course of the trade. But the number obscures the machinery. This wasn't pandemonium. It was commerce. Carefully structured, meticulously financed, globally connected commerce backed by the most powerful governments and financial institutions in the Western world. European trading companies had shareholders who expected returns on investment. They had boards of directors and company charters and annual reports and insurance underwriters who calculated risk premiums on their cargo, and the cargo was you. Ships were designed specifically for this trade. Naval architects drew blueprints for the holds, calculating how to pack the maximum number of human bodies into the available space the way a modern logistics firm would optimize a shipping container. They installed wooden shelving, stacked so close together that the people lying on them couldn't sit upright, couldn't turn over without pressing against the body next to them. They calculated provisions based on survival rates, not comfort, because every death in transit was a deduction from the profit margin. The Royal African Company, the Dutch West India Company, the French Compagnie du Sénégal. These weren't criminal organizations hiding from the law. They were among the most prestigious business enterprises in the world, endorsed by monarchs, financed by aristocrats, and celebrated in the capitals of Europe. The Middle Passage. That's what history named the ocean crossing from West Africa to the Americas, as if calling it a passage could somehow smooth over what it actually was. The journey lasted anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on weather, currents, and how many ports the ship visited. You're chained below deck in a hold, designed to carry the maximum number of human bodies the vessel can accommodate without capsizing in rough seas. The ceiling is so low that sitting upright means pressing your shoulders against the planks above you. You're wedged against strangers on every side, people from different nations, different language groups, different cultures and religions, all experiencing the same incomprehensible terror in near total darkness. The heat below deck was devastating. Temperatures in the holds routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air quality was so poor that candles placed in the hold would gutter and die, which tells you precisely what the people down there were breathing. The smell is the detail that every historical account agrees was the most overwhelming, and the detail that language can barely approach. Human waste, because there were no toilets, no buckets that could contain what hundreds of sick and terrified people produce. Vomit, the metallic tang of blood, the sweet, sharp scent of infected wounds, and death, because people died constantly. Between 15 and 20% of the Africans loaded onto slave ships did not survive the crossing. They died of dysentery, of smallpox, of dehydration, of scurvy, of fever, and of a condition that the ship surgeons called fixed melancholy, which was their way of saying that some people simply lost the will to live. Some refused to eat, understanding that starvation was the only form of agency the ship hadn't stripped from them. The crew had an instrument for that, a speculum oris, a metal device forced between the teeth to pry the jaw open so that gruel could be poured down the throat. Your death was their financial loss. Others jumped overboard when brought on deck for what the crew called dancing, forced exercise sessions designed to keep your muscles from atrophying, which would lower your price at auction. The crew played drums or fiddles, while the captives were made to move. Dancing, they called it. The word itself is a crime. Even the brief mercy of sunlight and movement on deck was calculated around profit, not compassion. Every decision made on that ship was a financial calculation. You were the commodity those calculations existed to protect, and yet, even in conditions specifically engineered to destroy every trace of human agency and human connection, people resisted. Historians have documented more than 400 revolts aboard slave ships. Most were suppressed. Some succeeded. Women often played decisive roles because the crew, in its casual contempt, frequently kept them less heavily chained. That underestimation cost lives. People who couldn't fight found other ways to push back. They sang in their own languages, a deliberate preservation of identity against the annihilating silence of the hold. They formed bonds with fellow captives that scholars call shipmate relationships, connections forged in shared suffering that would sustain families and communities for generations after landfall. In the darkness of the hold, with everything else stripped away, the person chained next to you became your kin. That wasn't sentimentality. That was survival. The ship arrives. You're hauled up from the hold, blinking against sunlight you haven't seen in weeks or months. Maybe you're in Virginia, maybe South Carolina, maybe a Caribbean island where you'll undergo what the traders called seasoning, one of the most chilling euphemisms in the history of language. Seasoning meant breaking you. It meant forced labor under extreme conditions, isolation from anyone who shared your language, systematic violence, the destruction of your name, your cultural practices, your sense of self. The goal was compliance. Many people didn't survive the process. Those who emerged from it were considered ready for market. Let's anchor ourselves in 1619. A privateer vessel called the White Lion sailed into Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying approximately 20 Africans who'd been seized from a Portuguese slave ship called the San Juan Bautista. They were exchanged for provisions. This wasn't the start of African slavery in the New World. The Spanish and Portuguese had been running slave economies in the Caribbean and South America for over a century. But 1619 is when slavery arrived in English-speaking North America, and what grew from that arrival became the most comprehensive, the most legally codified, the most economically integrated system of human bondage in modern history. What set American slavery apart was one word: chattel. In chattel slavery, the enslaved person is not a servant fulfilling a contract, not a prisoner serving time, not a debtor working off an obligation. You are property, legally, permanently, heritably property. You can be bought, sold, mortgaged, leased, gifted, inherited, insured, and wagered exactly like a house or a mule or a barrel of flour. Your children are property from their first breath. Their children will be property. There is no expiration date, no appeal mechanism, no path to freedom built into the system itself. Every court in every state classifies you as a thing, and the full force of the law stands ready to enforce that classification. This legal framework was assembled deliberately, one statute at a time, over decades. In the first years of the Virginia colony, the boundaries between indentured servitude and slavery were genuinely blurry. Some Africans who arrived in the early 1600s served terms and were released. Some acquired land and prospered. Anthony Johnson, an Angolan who arrived around 1621, eventually gained his freedom, acquired a 250-acre farm on Virginia's eastern shore, and won a court case granting him lifetime control over another man's labor. The fact that a black man could navigate the early colonial legal system and succeed tells you that permanent racial slavery was not some natural or inevitable condition. It was built, brick by legislative brick, choice by deliberate choice. By the 1640s and 1650s, courts began drawing distinctions between European servants who served fixed terms and African captives who could be held indefinitely. By the 1660s, the distinctions were being written into law. And in 1662, Virginia passed the statute that became the keystone of the entire structure: partus sequitur ventrum. The offspring follows the condition of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child was enslaved, regardless of the father. Think about what that one legal principle accomplished. It turned enslaved women's bodies into engines of perpetual wealth. Every child born to an enslaved woman automatically became the slaveholder's property. It created a direct financial incentive for the sexual assault of enslaved women by the men who claimed to own them, because the children produced by that violence were free labor. It meant the system would compound itself, generation after generation, without a single additional ship crossing the Atlantic, one sentence of legal Latin, and 2.5 centuries of horrors had their foundation. The statutes kept accumulating. Each legislative session added new restrictions, laws criminalizing the teaching of literacy to enslaved people, laws requiring written passes for any enslaved person traveling off the plantation, laws forbidding groups of enslaved people from gathering without white supervision, laws that stripped free black people of the right to vote, own firearms, or testify against white people in court, laws requiring legislative approval before a slaveholder could free any enslaved person, laws defining anyone with even a trace of African ancestry as black, and therefore potentially enslavable. Each statute reinforced the ones before it, until the structure was so massive and so deeply woven into every aspect of daily life that people stopped seeing it as something that had been built at all. They started calling it natural. They said God ordained it. They published scientific papers demonstrating that black people were biologically designed for labor and incapable of self-governance. The system didn't just enslave bodies. It colonized the nation's capacity to recognize what it was doing. Let's step onto the plantation now, because this is where history breathes, and where the people who endured it become real rather than statistical. You wake before the horn. Some internal clock, calibrated by years of this routine, pulls you from sleep in the darkness. When the horn does sound, cutting through the pre-dawn air like a blade, you have minutes to be dressed, outside, and standing in the yard for the day's assignment. There is no snooze button in this life. There is no flexibility in this schedule. The overseer's livelihood depends on how much work he extracts from the people under his authority, and he is relentlessly good at his job. Your cabin is a single room, roughly 12 feet by 14, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, and clay that lets the wind whistle through in January and holds the heat like an oven in July. The floor is packed dirt, hard and cool against bare feet. Your sleeping surface is a wooden plank, possibly softened by a straw-filled tick, possibly not. A blanket, if you're fortunate. You share this space with your family, or with whoever the slaveholder has assigned to live here, because your sleeping arrangements, like everything else about your existence, belong to someone else. Outside, the air carries that particular pre-dawn weight. In the deep south, even winter mornings can be mild, and summer mornings are merely the first movement of a symphony of heat that will intensify until the late afternoon threatens to melt your vision. The smell registers immediately. Earth, dark and heavy and damp. Manure from the livestock and the fields. The faint sweetness of whatever dominates the acreage, cotton or tobacco or sugarcane, each with its own particular scent. And underneath everything, the smell of labor that has soaked into your clothes and your skin and become indistinguishable from you. Your clothing is Osnaburg, a coarse linen manufactured cheaply in bulk, specifically for enslaved laborers. It scratches every inch of skin it contacts. You receive 2 sets a year, maybe 3 on wealthier plantations. These are not tailored garments. They're rough-cut shirts and trousers in approximate sizes. Shoes are a winter allocation on some plantations, non-existent on others. Your feet, bare for most of the year, have developed calluses so thick they might as well be leather. Your body has adapted to conditions no body should ever have to adapt to, and that forced adaptation carries its own silent grief. Breakfast, when it happens, is quick and austere. Cornbread, maybe a strip of salt pork that's more salt than pork. Leftover hominy from the night before, congealed and cold. The slaveholder allocates food with the same logic a farmer uses when calculating feed for livestock. The standard weekly ration was roughly a peck of cornmeal, about 8 quarts, and 3 to 4 pounds of pork or bacon. That was the sum of what the slaveholder provided. Everything beyond that you grew, harvested, and cooked yourself. And this is where something extraordinary emerges inside the cruelty. The the garden plots that enslaved people tended on their own time, in the dark after the day's forced labor was over, on whatever marginal ground the slaveholder allowed them to use, became gardens of cultural preservation and quiet genius. Okra seeds carried across the Atlantic in the hair and clothing of captives, cultivated with knowledge passed down through generations. Rice, and not just any rice, but sophisticated tidal irrigation and cultivation techniques brought from the Senegambia region of West Africa. Knowledge so specialized that the slaveholders who profited enormously from Carolina rice couldn't have grown a single crop without the enslaved people who actually understood how to do it. The slaveholders took the wealth. The people with the knowledge took the lash. Sweet potatoes, collard greens, black-eyed peas, field peas, the one-pot stews born of necessity. The seasoning that turned meager ingredients into something that tasted like home and memory and defiance all at once. Recipes passed from mothers to daughters in whispered conversations over a fire, after 14 hours in the fields, in the only moments of the day that felt even remotely like your own. What emerged from those garden plots and those iron pots wasn't just food. It was culture. It was identity. It was the birth of what we now call soul food, one of the foundational cuisines of the American South, and one of the great culinary traditions of the world. It was created in the spaces where enslaved people exercised the closest thing to autonomy that the system allowed, and they poured their entire selves into it. The workday begins, and from a modern vantage point, its scope is genuinely difficult to comprehend. If you're laboring on a cotton plantation, and by the 1830s and 1840s, cotton is the economic engine that drives the entire nation, your life revolves around the plant and its unforgiving cycle. Planting season means walking the rows endlessly, bending to drop seeds, covering them, moving on. Row after row, hour after hour. Growing season brings the hoe, that deceptively simple tool that becomes the central object of your waking existence. You chop weeds between the cotton plants from sunrise until the light dies, 12 to 14 hours at a stretch, in heat that regularly exceeds 95 degrees and often pushes past 100. The sun isn't background scenery in this story. It's a physical force pressing down on you with tangible weight. Sweat saturates your Osnaburg shirt within the first hour and doesn't relent. Water comes when the overseer decides it comes. Then picking season arrives. September through January, the economic culmination of everything the plantation exists to do. You move down rows of waist-high cotton plants with a long sack dragging from your shoulder. You pull the bolls from the stalks, the white cotton nestled in dried husks called burrs that are as sharp as thorns. They slice your fingers open. They embed under your nails. By midday, your hands are bleeding. By sundown, they're a map of cuts and dried blood and raw skin. And the sack grows heavier with every step, dragging at your back and shoulder and neck with a weight that accumulates hour by hour until you can feel it in your spine. Every night, your cotton is weighed. The slaveholder has set a daily quota, and that quota is non-negotiable. Fall short and you're whipped. Exceed it, and tomorrow's number goes up. There was no equilibrium in this system, no point where you could say, I've done enough. The machine demanded more, always more. Historians who've studied the picking records that slaveholders meticulously maintained have documented a pattern of relentless acceleration. Cotton picked per enslaved person roughly doubled between 1800 and 1860, and that increase was purchased entirely in blood and exhaustion and broken bodies. We have to talk about the whip now, because every honest telling of this story requires it. Whipping was not an occasional punishment on American plantations. It was the primary management tool, as routine and as central to daily operations as the hoe or the cotton gin. The overseer carried a bull whip or a cowhide the way a modern supervisor might carry a tablet. 20 lashes for a light cotton bag at weigh-in, 30 for moving too slowly, 50 for running, 100 for raising a hand against a white person. The lash was applied to bare skin, usually the back, with full force, by men whose continued employment depended on their willingness to swing it. The sound carried, the crack of leather against flesh, the involuntary cry that followed. Every person on the plantation heard it. That was the point. Whipping wasn't solely about the individual tied to the post. It was about every person standing in the yard watching, internalizing the message that they were next if they stepped out of line. It was mass psychological control, administered one body at a time. The scars were permanent, thick ridges of raised tissue that mapped the slaveholder's authority across your skin, in a language that required no literacy to read. Some plantations recorded whippings in their ledgers with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for noting the weather or the price of corn. But here's what the whip could never reach. It couldn't touch what happened after dark, in the quarters, when the day's surveillance lifted and the night belonged, however briefly, to you. It couldn't silence the singing. The spirituals that rose from enslaved communities in the American South are among the most extraordinary cultural achievements in human history, and their genius lies in the sheer number of things they accomplished simultaneously. They were worship, drawing on African musical traditions of call and response, polyrhythm, and pentatonic melody. They were communal expression, a way of processing grief and hope and fury and love all at once. They were the preservation of African identity against a system designed to obliterate it, and they were a coded intelligence network operating in plain hearing of the people it was designed to evade. When enslaved people sang about crossing over Jordan, the slaveholder heard a quaint hymn about heaven. But sometimes Jordan meant the Ohio River, and crossing meant escape, and the song was a signal that a conductor was in position. Wade in the water was tactical guidance. Bloodhounds lose a scent trail in running water. Follow the drinking gourd was an astronomical navigation chart, pointing toward the Big Dipper and the North Star. Steal away to Jesus could signal a clandestine prayer meeting in the woods or an imminent escape attempt. The slaveholders had criminalized literacy. They hadn't thought to criminalize melody. And enslaved people weaponized that oversight into perhaps the most elegant communication system in the history of resistance. Literacy spread despite every legal barrier erected to stop it. Teaching an enslaved person to read was a criminal offense across the South, punishable by fines, imprisonment, and whipping for both teacher and student. The reasoning was transparent. A literate enslaved person could read an abolitionist pamphlet, could forge a travel pass, could write a letter, could pass the legal code well enough to see exactly how thoroughly it was rigged. Knowledge was power, and the system correctly identified knowledge as its enemy, so they banned it, and it spread anyway. In secret night schools, in whispered lessons behind the cabins, in the dirt with a stick for a pen. Frederick Douglass would become the most commanding orator of the 19th century, learned his letters by trading bread to white children in Baltimore. He later wrote that reading was the pathway from slavery to freedom. The slaveholders who made it a crime agreed with him. That's precisely why they made it a crime. But cotton wasn't the only crop that ran on enslaved labor, and in some ways, it wasn't even the cruelest. Let's talk about sugar. because the sugar plantations of Louisiana deserved their own circle in the geography of American slavery. If cotton was backbreaking, sugar was body-destroying. The entire process, from planting to harvest to processing, was more dangerous, more physically devastating, and more deadly than any other form of agricultural labor in the United States. Sugar planters in Louisiana imported enslaved people from the Upper South, the way a factory imports raw materials, and the comparison isn't metaphorical. They used people up and replaced them. The sugar harvest, called grinding season, ran from October through January, and during those months, the plantation operated around the clock. You cut cane with a heavy machete in fields that were often waterlogged, your legs submerged to the shins in muddy water while snakes and insects shared the space. The cane itself was thick and fibrous and fighting you the entire time. You cut all day, and then, because the cane had to be processed before it dried out, you worked the sugar house through the night. The sugar house was its own particular horror. Massive rollers crushed the cane to extract the juice, and feeding cane into those rollers was one of the most dangerous jobs in American agriculture. Fingers caught, hands caught, arms caught. An overseer kept a hatchet nearby for the express purpose of amputating a limb before the rollers pulled the entire person through. The juice was then boiled in a series of enormous kettles, each one hotter than the last, in a room filled with steam so dense you could barely see the person standing next to you. Burns were constant. The heat was otherworldly. You worked in shifts, but the shifts were 12 hours long, and during grinding season, they might stretch to 16 or 18. The death rate on Louisiana sugar plantations was so high that the enslaved population could not sustain itself through natural increase. While cotton plantations in the Upper South often had growing enslaved populations, sugar plantations consumed people faster than they could be replaced locally. This was one of the driving forces behind the domestic slave trade, the internal commerce in human beings that became one of the largest forced migrations in American history. Let's sit with the domestic slave trade for a moment, because this is a part of the story that often gets overshadowed by the transatlantic crossing. After the United States banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, the supply of enslaved labor had to come from within. And it did. Over the next 5 decades, approximately 1 million enslaved people were sold from the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, to the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. 1 million people marched in coffles, groups of enslaved people chained together and forced to walk hundreds of miles to their new destination. These journeys could take weeks. They moved through the interior of the country, visible to everyone, a river of human misery flowing south to feed the cotton and sugar machines. The domestic trade was organized around a network of professional slave traders, men who purchased enslaved people in one market and sold them in another at a profit. They maintained holding pens in major cities, buildings where enslaved people were kept while awaiting sale. In some cities, these facilities were practically next door to the halls of government. In Washington, D.C., the capital of a nation founded on the principle of liberty, you could look out the window of the Capitol building and see a slave pen. The irony was not lost on visiting Europeans, though it seemed to be lost on the Americans. The domestic trade was the mechanism that tore apart more families than any other single feature of the system. When a Virginia slaveholder decided he needed cash, or when the tobacco economy declined and cotton was more profitable farther south, the result was the sale of human beings away from everyone they'd ever known. The phrase, "sold down the river," became a common expression in American English. and it originated here, describing the journey down the Mississippi to the slave markets of Natchez and New Orleans. It entered the language because the experience it described was so common and so devastating that it needed its own shorthand. Now let's step inside the community life that enslaved people built, despite every structural attempt to prevent it, because this is the heart of the story. The quarters, those rows of small cabins where enslaved people lived, were more than housing. They were neighborhoods. They were communities with their own social structures, their own hierarchies, their own systems of mutual support that operated entirely outside the slaveholder's control, and often entirely without his knowledge. Saturday nights on many plantations were something close to sacred. After 6 days of forced labor, the evening belonged, at least partially, to you. People gathered. They cooked communal meals that were different from the meager rations of the work week. Sometimes an animal caught hunting or fishing in the limited free time available. Sometimes vegetables from the garden cooked with the care and spice that made plain ingredients into something meaningful. They told stories, preserving oral traditions that stretched back to West Africa and forward into what would become a uniquely American literary tradition. Br'er Rabbit, the trickster who outsmarted those more powerful than himself, wasn't just a children's tale. He was a survival manual wrapped in fur and humor. They played music, creating sounds that blended African rhythmic traditions with whatever instruments were available. Banjos fashioned from gourds, drums made from hollow logs, fiddles passed down or borrowed or built from scratch. The banjo itself has African origins, descended from instruments like the akonting of West Africa, and his journey into American music is one of the most significant cultural transfers in the history of the Western Hemisphere. They danced. After days that would have killed the joy in most people, they danced. Ring shouts, a form of worship and celebration that involved rhythmic movement in a circle, accompanied by singing and hand clapping, connected the community to African spiritual practices that the slaveholders' enforced Christianity could not erase. These weren't just recreational activities. They were acts of cultural survival, deliberate and intentional and fiercely maintained. Every ring shout, every story, every meal shared in the quarters was a statement that the slaveholder did not own everything. The body might belong to the plantation, but the soul belonged to the community, and the community refused to die. Religion played a complex and powerful role in enslaved people's lives. The slaveholders pushed Christianity on the enslaved population, but the version they pushed was carefully curated. The sermons enslaved people heard from white preachers emphasized obedience, patience, and the rewards of the afterlife. Servants, obey your masters. The meek shall inherit the earth. Every passage that could be weaponized into compliance was deployed with enthusiasm. But enslaved people took Christianity and made it something entirely their own. The God they worshipped in the brush arbors, the secret outdoor meeting places hidden in the woods beyond the slaveholders' surveillance, was not the slaveholders' God of obedience. He was a God of liberation. The Exodus story, Moses leading the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage, became the central narrative of enslaved Christianity. It wasn't an allegory, it was a prophecy. God had freed his people before, and he would do it again. The prayers offered in those hidden meetings weren't prayers for patience. They were prayers for freedom, for deliverance, for the strength to endure until deliverance came. And the preachers who led these meetings, enslaved men and women who spoke with a power and eloquence that shook the ground, were among the most important leaders in enslaved communities. Nat Turner was a preacher. So were many of the people who organized escapes, led resistance, and held communities together under impossible pressure. The hush harbour, that's what they called those secret gathering places, down in the woods, in a clearing, with someone posted as lookout to watch for patrols. They would sometimes overturn a pot, believing it would muffle the sound of their singing and praying. Whether or not the pot actually worked as an acoustic baffle is beside the point. The act of gathering in, secret, of worshipping on your own terms, of building spiritual community beyond the reach of the overseer's whip, was itself a victory. Every hush harbour service was a declaration that the slaveholders' version of God was a lie, and that the truth was something bigger and fiercer and more loving than anything the plantation chapel offered. Let's also talk about the skilled workers within the enslaved population, because the common image of slavery as purely field labor obscures how deeply enslaved expertise penetrated every aspect of the Southern economy. Enslaved people were blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, bricklayers, seamstresses, cooks, midwives, healers, butchers, coachmen, and 100 other specialized occupations. They built the plantation houses that slaveholders lived in. They built the churches where slaveholders prayed. They built the courthouses where the laws that enslaved them were written and enforced. The ironwork that decorates the French Quarter in New Orleans was created by enslaved and free black artisans whose skill was so renowned that their work is now a protected historical landmark. The Capitol building in Washington was constructed in part by enslaved laborers. The literal architecture of American freedom was built by a people who did not have any. Enslaved women carried additional burdens that deserve specific attention. Beyond the grueling field labor or domestic work that occupied their days, enslaved women were vulnerable to sexual exploitation in ways that the system not only permitted, but incentivized. The Pater Sequitur Ventrem law meant that children born to enslaved women were automatically enslaved, regardless of paternity. This gave slaveholders direct financial motivation to assault the women they claimed to own. The children produced by these assaults were sometimes kept as slaves on the same plantation, sometimes sold, and sometimes existed in a torturous in-between, where they were both the enslaver's children and the enslaver's property. The legal system offered no protection. There was no concept of an enslaved woman being raped by her owner, because the law did not recognize her capacity to consent or refuse. This was not a hidden aspect of slavery. It was structural. Enslaved women also served as the primary nurturers and caregivers of their communities. They delivered babies, often without any medical assistance. They tended the sick with a knowledge of herbal medicine that blended African traditional practices with locally available plants. They cooked and preserved food, mended clothing, maintained the cabins, and held families together under conditions designed to tear them apart. When children were orphaned by sale or death, other women in the quarters absorbed them. When someone was too ill or too elderly to care for themselves, the women of the community organized their care. The survival of enslaved communities, physically and emotionally, rested disproportionately on the labor and love of enslaved women, and their contributions have been disproportionately overlooked. Now, as we return to the national story, let's give the war the attention it requires, because the Civil War was not simply a political event. For 4 million enslaved people, it was an apocalypse and a resurrection happening simultaneously. When the war began in April 1861, enslaved people across the South immediately understood what it might mean, even as their enslavers insisted that the conflict would be brief and that the peculiar institution was in no danger. Enslaved people had their own information networks, grapevines that transmitted news with remarkable speed and accuracy. They knew about abolitionist debates. They knew about Lincoln's election. They knew that the war, whatever its official justifications, was fundamentally about them. From the earliest days of the conflict, enslaved people voted with their feet. They walked off plantations by the hundreds, then by the thousands, heading toward Union Army lines. This wasn't a chaotic flight. It was a strategic mass action. People waited for the right moment, gathered their families when possible, took provisions, and moved under cover of darkness toward the nearest Union encampment. The military initially had no idea what to do with them. Some generals returned them to their enslavers, following the letter of existing law. Others, like Benjamin Butler at Fort Monroe in Virginia, found a legal workaround by declaring them contraband of war, enemy property that had been seized. The term was dehumanizing, but it kept people from being sent back to bondage. As the war ground on and Union casualties mounted, the argument for black enlistment became impossible to resist. When the doors finally opened, the response was immediate. Black men from across the North, from the border states, and from the South itself lined up to serve. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the first black regiment raised in the North, became famous for its assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina, a charge that was tactically suicidal and strategically transformative. They didn't take the fort, but their courage under fire silenced a generation of racist claims about black men's capacity for military service. In total, black soldiers participated in roughly 40 major battles and hundreds of smaller engagements. They earned at least 25 medals of honor, and they died, roughly 40,000 of them, fighting for a nation that hadn't yet decided whether they were citizens. Behind the lines, enslaved people who remained on plantations engaged in their own form of warfare. They slowed their labor to a crawl, starving the Confederate economy of the production it desperately needed. They shared intelligence with Union forces, providing information about troop movements, supply routes, and defensive positions that proved invaluable. Harriet Tubman herself served as a Union spy and scout in South Carolina, leading a raid along the Combahee River in 1863 that liberated over 700 enslaved people in a single night, making her the first woman to lead an armed military operation in American history. The war was fought on battlefields, yes, but it was also fought in the fields and the kitchens and the slave quarters of every plantation in the South, by people whose names never appeared in any official dispatch. Let's talk about what happened in the different crop regions, because the experience of slavery varied enormously depending on what the land was being used to grow, and each variation had its own particular nightmare. We've talked about cotton and sugar, but there were other worlds within this world. Tobacco was the original cash crop, the one that made Virginia wealthy long before cotton was king. Tobacco cultivation was labor-intensive, but followed a different rhythm than cotton. The plants required careful tending, transplanting seedlings from seedbeds to fields, then months of weeding, topping the plants to prevent flowering, removing sucking leaves that diverted the plant's energy. The harvest involved cutting the stalks, hanging them in curing barns, where fires were kept burning at precise temperatures, then sorting, stemming, and packing the dried leaves into hogsheads, massive barrels that could weigh 1,000 pounds and had to be rolled to the nearest wharf for shipping. Every step required knowledge and skill, and enslaved people were the ones who possessed it. The irony of tobacco is that it exhausted the soil rapidly, which meant that tobacco planters were always looking for new land, which meant enslaved people were constantly being moved westward as the land they'd worked was worn out and abandoned. You could spend years building a life in one place, building friendships, planting a garden, knowing the paths and the trees and the sounds of a particular landscape, and then find yourself uprooted and marched to a new frontier because the dirt you'd labored over had nothing left to give. Rice was perhaps the most remarkable story of all because it exposes one of the great unacknowledged truths of American slavery. The slaveholders often depended entirely on the knowledge of the people they enslaved. Rice cultivation in the Carolina Low Country was not something European colonists knew how to do. They didn't understand the tidal irrigation systems required. They didn't know which varieties to plant or when to plant them or how to process the harvested grain. That knowledge came from West Africa, specifically from the rice-growing regions of Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast, where rice had been cultivated for centuries. Enslaved people from these regions were specifically sought out by Carolina planters, who were willing to pay premium prices for their expertise. So here you have a situation where the entire economic foundation of one of the wealthiest colonies in British North America was built on knowledge that the enslaved population possessed and the slaveholding class did not. The enslaved didn't just do the labor, they provided the intellectual capital, and they received nothing for either. Rice cultivation was brutal in its own particular way. The low-country rice fields were essentially managed swamps. You worked standing in water, sometimes up to your waist, in heat and humidity that turned the air into something you had to swim through rather than breathe. Mosquitoes were relentless. Malaria was endemic. The death rates among enslaved rice workers were among the highest in North America. The slaveholders themselves often fled the low country during the summer months, retreating to Charleston or the mountains to escape the fever season, leaving the enslaved population to work and die in the swamps under the supervision of overseers. The rice that made the planters rich was harvested by people dying of diseases that the planters escaped by simply not being there. Within the quarters, life was richer and more complex than the slaveholders ever imagined or cared to understand. Enslaved communities developed their own systems of justice and social order. Disputes were settled by respected elders whose authority came not from the slaveholder, but from the community itself. There were codes of behavior, expectations about how you treated your neighbors, how you shared resources, how you conducted yourself. There were courtship rituals that were entirely the community's own, separate from anything the slaveholder sanctioned or even knew about. Young people fell in love on their own terms, in their own time, using their own traditions, even when they knew that the slaveholder could intervene at any moment and destroy what they'd built. Children grew up in these communities in a strange double world. They were surrounded by love and care and the protective watchfulness of an entire community. They were also aware, from a very young age, of what they were, formerly enslaved people who wrote about their childhoods, frequently described a specific moment of realization, the moment they understood that they were property, that their mother could be sold, that the man who controlled their life could do anything to them, and there was no one who could stop it. The loss of innocence in enslaved children wasn't gradual. It was a cliff edge, and once you went over it, you could never go back. Enslaved people also developed sophisticated medical knowledge that blended African herbal traditions with observation and experimentation in the American environment. Healers within the community, often women, knew which plants could reduce a fever, ease a cough, help with childbirth, or treat a wound. They knew about sassafras and pokeweed and jimsonweed and dozens of other plants that grew in the forest and along the edges of the fields. When slaveholders got sick, they sometimes turned to enslaved healers, rather than the expensive and often useless physicians available to them. This medical knowledge was passed down orally, generation to generation, and represented another domain of expertise that the enslaved population maintained independently of and often superior to the slaveholder class. The concept of free black communities in the antebellum period also deserves attention, because the existence of free black people was a constant living contradiction of the ideology that justified slavery. By 1860, there were approximately 500,000 free black people living in the United States, concentrated in cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Charleston, and New Orleans. Some had been freed by individual slaveholders. Some had purchased their own freedom through years of saving from hired-out labor. Some had been born free, and some had simply disappeared from the plantation and reinvented themselves in a city where nobody knew their face. Free black communities built remarkable institutions, churches first and always, then schools, newspapers, mutual aid societies, fraternal organizations, literary societies. In Philadelphia, Richard Allen founded the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1816, creating a denomination that would become one of the most important institutions in black American life. In Baltimore, free black people established schools decades before the public school system existed for white children. In New York and Boston, black newspapers like Freedom's Journal and the North Star gave voice to communities that the mainstream press ignored or demonized. But freedom for black people in antebellum America was always conditional and always precarious. Free black people in the South faced restrictions that made their freedom look more like a slightly longer leash. They couldn't vote. They couldn't testify against white people. They needed to carry papers proving their free status at all times. And even those papers didn't guarantee safety when a slave catcher decided you looked like somebody's missing property. In the North, free black people faced discrimination in employment, housing, education, and public life. They were barred from most skilled trades. They were confined to the worst neighborhoods. Their children attended segregated schools when schools were available at all. The existence of free black communities was a testament to human determination, but it was also a daily demonstration of how thoroughly racism operated at every level of American society, independent of the formal institution of slavery. These free black communities were also the backbone of the abolitionist movement. While white abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and the Grimke sisters receive prominent attention in the standard narrative, the abolitionist movement was driven from its earliest days by black voices and black organizing. David Walker's Appeal, published in 1829, was one of the most incendiary documents of the antebellum period, a furious denunciation of slavery and racism that called for resistance by any means necessary. Frederick Douglass, after escaping from slavery in Maryland, became the most powerful orator in the movement, his speeches and writings dismantling pro-slavery arguments with a precision and eloquence that left his opponents without ground to stand on. Sojourner Truth, who had been enslaved in New York, became one of the most compelling speakers of the era, connecting the cause of abolition with the cause of women's rights in ways that still resonate. Harriet Jacobs wrote about her experience of slavery with a searing honesty about the sexual exploitation of enslaved women that white abolitionists often preferred to discuss in euphemisms. These were the voices that pushed the nation toward the reckoning it had been avoiding since its founding. The free black communities were also the primary organizers and funders of the Underground Railroad. It was free black families who opened their homes to fugitives, who collected money for provisions and transportation, who maintained the communication networks that made the entire operation function. the standard image of the railroad as a primarily Quaker operation, does a disservice to the black communities who bore the greatest risk and performed the most essential work. Let's also reckon with the ideology more deeply, because understanding the mental machinery of slavery is essential to understanding how the system survived for as long as it did, and why its echoes persist. The racial ideology that supported American slavery wasn't a thin veneer of justification laid over naked greed, though it was certainly that too. It was a comprehensive worldview, built over centuries, reinforced by every institution in American life, and internalized so deeply that many white Americans couldn't see it as ideology at all. They saw it as truth, the science, so-called. In the early 19th century, a school of thought called polygenism argued that the different races of humanity were actually separate species, created independently, with different capacities and different destinies. Samuel Morton collected hundreds of human skulls and measured their volumes, concluding, to no one's surprise, that white skulls were larger and therefore evidence of greater intelligence. Josiah Nott and George Glidden published Types of Mankind in 1854, arguing that racial hierarchy was a fact of nature as immutable as the law of gravity. These weren't marginal cranks. They were published by mainstream presses, reviewed in major journals, and cited by politicians as evidence that the existing social order was simply the natural one. The pseudoscience of racial hierarchy was one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in human history, and its influence extended far beyond the borders of the slaveholding South. The religion, as deployed by the slaveholding class, was equally comprehensive. Preachers in the South developed what historians call the theology of slavery, a body of sermonizing that drew on carefully selected biblical passages to argue that slavery was not merely tolerated by God, but actively endorsed. The curse of Ham, Paul's instructions to servants, the idea that suffering on earth would be rewarded in heaven. These arguments were presented with complete sincerity by ministers who then went home to plantations worked by people they just told to be content in their chains. The split this created within American Christianity was deep and lasting. The Baptist and Methodist denominations each fractured over slavery, with southern branches defending the institution and northern branches increasingly opposing it. The moral authority of the American church has never fully recovered from the fact that half of it spent the antebellum period telling enslaved people that God wanted them to remain enslaved. And the law was the most powerful tool of all, because the law carried the full force of the state behind it. The slave codes that governed every southern state were astonishingly detailed. They regulated what enslaved people could wear, where they could go, when they could be outdoors, who they could speak to, what they could own, whether they could marry, whether they could learn to read, whether they could worship without supervision, whether they could carry a walking stick that might be used as a weapon. They created the slave patrol system, which empowered any white man to stop, question, search, and detain any black person found without proper documentation. They established the legal infrastructure for buying and selling human beings as property, including standardized contracts, bills of sale, and warranty provisions that treated people with the same legal language used for horses and land. And they were enforced not just by courts and sheriffs, but by the entire white population, which was effectively deputized to maintain the racial order at all times. Now let's step back from the plantation and look at the entire economy, because slavery was not a regional quirk of the southern states. It was the financial engine that built the United States of America, and pretending otherwise is one of the most persistent and self-serving lies in the national mythology. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the 4 million enslaved people in the United States represented more financial value than the nation's railroads, factories, and banking capital combined. Enslaved human beings were the single largest asset class in the entire American economy. Not cotton, not land, not manufactured goods, people. Cotton grown by enslaved labor accounted for well over half of all American export revenue. The cotton moved from plantation to port on ships financed by northern banks. It crossed the Atlantic to British mills in Manchester and Liverpool, where it was spun and woven into cloth and sold across the globe. Northern textile mills in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island processed raw cotton into finished products. Northern banks, including some whose corporate descendants still operate under respected names, underwrote the loans that purchased the land, built the plantation houses, and bought the people who worked them. They accepted enslaved people as collateral for mortgages. They foreclosed on plantations and auctioned off human beings alongside the furniture and the silverware. Insurance companies wrote policies on enslaved people, collecting premiums and paying out claims when the property died. Wall Street itself has enslaved labor embedded in its institutional DNA. This was not the South Sin alone. It was the nation's investment strategy. The auction block is where all of this became flesh and where the flesh was priced. Picture yourself standing on a raised wooden platform in the courtyard of the St. Charles Hotel in New Orleans, the largest and most sophisticated slave market in the Western Hemisphere. Maybe you're in one of the open-air markets of Natchez or Richmond or Charleston or Memphis. Cities across the South had thriving markets in human beings, as essential to the regional economy as stock exchanges or commodity pits. You've been prepared for this. The trader who brought you here has cleaned you up, selected clothes that make you look healthy and strong. If you're ill, you've been dosed with something to mask the symptoms. If your back carries the evidence of the whip, your skin has been oiled, either to minimize the scars or to display them, depending on what the buyer considers desirable. Buyers examine you the way they'd evaluate a horse at a livestock auction, because that is exactly the framework they are operating in. They open your mouth and check your teeth for signs of age or disease. They press their fingers into your arms and shoulders, testing muscle density. They make you walk, turn, bend, squat. They ask your age, though your answer may not match what the trader has listed. They ask what you can do. Can you plow? Can you cook? Can you sew? Can you work a gin? Have you been sick? Have you tried to run? If you're a woman, the questions get invasive quickly. How many children have you borne? How many survived? How quickly did you recover? Can you still bear children? Because your reproductive capacity is a separate line item on your price tag. A young, healthy woman in her childbearing years commanded premium prices because every child she produced was another piece of the buyer's wealth, another asset on the balance sheet, delivered at no additional cost. Children were sold away from their mothers as a matter of routine commercial practice. Husbands were separated from wives, parents from children, siblings from siblings. The legal framework that classified you as property meant your family had no standing whatsoever. No court in the South would prevent a slaveholder from selling your child, your spouse, your mother. The emotional devastation of these separations echoes through every single slave narrative that has ever been recorded or preserved. Mothers described the moment a child was taken from them as a kind of death, because in functional terms, it was. You would likely never learn where they'd been sent. You'd never know if they were fed, sheltered, alive. That anguish wasn't an unintended consequence of the system. It was part of its design. A population kept in perpetual emotional crisis is a population too shattered to organize, too afraid to rebel, too focused on the immediate pain of holding together to mount a sustained challenge to the system causing that pain. Grief was a management tool. And yet, in the face of this systematic destruction, enslaved people built families that endured. They married in ceremonies the law refused to recognize. They jumped the broom to seal vows that no courthouse would record, promising themselves to each other in acts of love so defiant that the word brave doesn't begin to cover it. They constructed kinship networks that stretched far beyond, blood ties, where every elder in the quarters was an auntie or uncle, where the entire community shared the responsibility of raising the children because any parent might vanish tomorrow. The family structures that enslaved people created under these conditions were not damaged versions of white family models. They were original creations, forged in fire, sustained by a love the law had no power to legislate away. Resistance. This is where we need to spend serious time, because the resistance to American slavery was constant, inventive, dangerous, and far more extensive than the version most people were taught in school. The enslaved population of the United States never stopped fighting back, and that fight took every form imaginable. Start with the revolts that shook the slaveholding class to its foundation. The Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, when a group of enslaved people armed themselves, killed several slaveholders, and marched south toward Spanish Florida, which had promised freedom to escaped slaves. They were stopped, and the colonial legislature responded with the Negro Act of 1740, among the most repressive slave codes in the colonies. Gabriel's conspiracy in Virginia in 1800, a meticulously planned uprising intended to capture the state capital with an army of enslaved men, numbering in the hundreds. It was betrayed before it launched, and Gabriel was hanged. But the scope of the plan stunned white Virginia into years of paranoid legislation. The German Coast Uprising of 1811 in Louisiana, the largest slave revolt in United States history, when several hundred enslaved people marched on New Orleans in military formation before being crushed by militia and federal troops. And Nat Turner, Southampton County, Virginia, 1831. The name the entire slaveholding South never stopped being afraid of. Turner was a literate, deeply religious enslaved man who believed he'd received divine instruction to strike. He organized an uprising that killed approximately 60 white people over 2 days before being overwhelmed by military force. The retaliation was savage and indiscriminate. White mobs across Virginia murdered hundreds of black people, the vast majority of whom had no connection to the rebellion. And every southern state legislature immediately tightened its slave codes, restricting literacy, assembly, religious practice, movement. They cracked down harder because Turner proved the system was vulnerable. His rebellion failed in its immediate aim. It succeeded in forcing the slaveholding class to reveal exactly how tenuous its grip truly was. But these headline rebellions were only the visible peaks of a mountain of daily resistance that never stopped. Enslaved people broke tools deliberately. They worked at a fraction of their capacity when the overseer's back was turned. They feigned illness with such conviction that doctors were summoned and could find nothing wrong. They pretended to misunderstand instructions. They set fires to barns and storage buildings. They poisoned livestock and, in documented cases, poisoned the food they served to the people who claimed to own them. They stole food, though calling it theft when the thief's entire existence has been stolen is a peculiar use of the word. They preserved African spiritual practices underneath a thin veneer of Christianity, that satisfied the slaveholders' surveillance. They told stories. They sang songs that carried coded information. Every act of cultural memory, every word of an African language spoken in secret, every rhythm drummed on a makeshift instrument was a declaration that the machine had not consumed them entirely. The risk was always present. The punishments were always severe. And the resistance never stopped. And they ran. Every year, thousands of enslaved people attempted escape. The slave patrol system, which historians have identified as among the earliest organized policing structures in American history, was established specifically to prevent exactly this. Mounted patrols with tracking dogs rode the roads and paths at night, stopping any black person who couldn't produce a written pass. The punishments for captured runaways were engineered to be unforgettable. Branding with a hot iron, amputation of toes so you couldn't run again, iron shackles worn for months, sail to the deep sugar parishes of Louisiana, where the labor was more brutal and the life expectancy shorter and the distance to freedom longer. The Underground Railroad remains the most famous organized escape network, and the real thing was even more remarkable than the simplified version most people encounter. It was not a single route with fixed stations. It was a shifting, adapting web of safe houses, guides, local sympathizers, and individuals of staggering bravery who risked their own freedom and their own lives to lead strangers to safety. The conductors were overwhelmingly black, free black citizens in northern cities, formerly enslaved people who had already made the harrowing journey to freedom, and then, almost unbelievably, went back into slave territory to bring others through. Harriet Tubman stands at the center of this story, and she earned that position through 13 trips back into the South after her own escape from Maryland in 1849. She guided approximately 70 people to freedom. She never lost a passenger. She carried a pistol and was forthright about its purpose. Anyone who got scared and wanted to turn back was a danger to every other person on the line, and she was not going to permit that. But Tubman, iconic as she is, was part of a much larger network of courage. Conductors and station keepers whose names were deliberately never written down because anonymity was their only shield. Free black communities in Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Detroit, and elsewhere organized elaborate systems of communication, shelter, and transport. Quaker communities opened their homes. In some places, entire towns were structured around the work of moving fugitives northward. The journey north was a prolonged ordeal of fear and endurance. You traveled at night, navigating by starlight when the sky cooperated, and by intuition and desperation when it didn't. You slogged through swamps because dogs can't track a scent through standing water. You forded rivers in darkness, not knowing the depth, the temperature, or the strength of the current. During daylight hours you hid, in attics, root cellars, hidden compartments in wagons, hollowed out spaces beneath floorboards, anywhere that could conceal a human body for the hours between sunrise and sunset. You waited, barely breathing, listening for the sounds of pursuit. And even if you made it north, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant you were not safe. Federal law now required northern citizens to assist in your capture. Free black people in northern cities lived in constant dread of being snatched off the street and sold south. And that dread was well-founded. It happened. It happened to Solomon Northup. It happened to many others whose names we will never know. The politics of slavery devoured the nation for generations. The Constitution itself was a compromise with the institution. The 3/5 clause granted slaveholding states extra seats in Congress by counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a human being for representation purposes. Enslaved people couldn't vote, couldn't speak, couldn't participate in any way, but their bodies inflated the political power of the men who enslaved them. The Electoral College reflected this arrangement. The Senate was designed to maintain equilibrium between slave and free states. Every new territory was a crisis. Every decade produced a new compromise that failed to resolve the fundamental contradiction between a nation built on liberty and an economy built on chains. Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott, in which the Supreme Court declared that black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Every attempt to manage the contradiction collapsed under its own weight because slavery was too profitable to contain and too monstrous to defend honestly. So the apologists got creative. Pseudoscience measured skulls and published papers arguing biological inferiority. Ministers preached that bondage was divinely ordained. Politicians stood on the Senate floor and called slavery a positive good. They didn't whisper it, they shouted it, and millions agreed. The war came because the contradictions finally detonated. And let's be direct about what ignited it, because a century and a half of revisionism has labored to replace the truth with something softer. The Southern states seceded to preserve and expand slavery. They said so, in writing, in their own declarations of secession. Mississippi named it in the second sentence. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens declared that the new government rested upon the great truth that the African is not the equal of the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. These are not interpretations, these are transcripts. The people who started the war told us exactly why they started it. The war became a war of liberation, partly because 4 million enslaved people refused to let it be anything else. They fled to Union lines in numbers that overwhelmed military planning and forced policy changes in real time. The army classified them as contraband of war, seized enemy property, which was dehumanizing terminology that nonetheless created a legal basis for not returning them to their enslavers. And when the Union opened enlistment to black men, the response was staggering. Nearly 180,000 black soldiers served during the Civil War. They fought in segregated units under white officers for less pay. They received the worst equipment and drew the most dangerous assignments. The Confederacy declared that captured black Union soldiers would not be treated as prisoners of war, but would be executed or re-enslaved. At Fort Pillow, Tennessee, in April 1864, Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest slaughtered black soldiers who had surrendered. It was not an isolated incident, it was policy, and still they fought, with a ferocity that stunned observers on both sides, because they were fighting for something no abstract political principle could match. They were fighting for the freedom of every person they'd ever known. The Emancipation Proclamation arrived on January 1st, 1863. It was simultaneously a moral document and a military tactic, or perhaps a military tactic that became a moral document. It freed enslaved people in Confederate states, which is to say in territory the Union did not control, while leaving slavery intact in border states loyal to the Union. Its practical reach was limited. Its symbolic force was world-altering. It declared this war to be a war against slavery itself. It authorized black military enlistment. It told 4 million people that freedom was no longer just a dream whispered in the quarters. It was coming. Unevenly, imperfectly, and far too slowly, but it was coming. Freedom arrived in pieces, on different days, in different places, and the experience of receiving it was as varied as the people who'd been waiting for it. In some places, Union soldiers rode onto plantations and read aloud the orders, while the slaveholder stood on his porch watching everything he'd built on stolen labor unravel in real time. In other places, enslaved people simply walked off. They put down the hoe or the cotton sack, turned their backs on the big house, and started walking, sometimes with no clear destination, just away. Some accounts describe people standing perfectly still when the news reached them, not moving, not speaking, as if the magnitude of the moment had temporarily stopped time itself. Others describe weeping, shouting, falling to their knees. Some people went looking for family members who'd been sold away years or decades before, walking hundreds of miles on foot with nothing but a name and a direction, and the desperate hope that the person they were looking for was still alive. In Texas, the news didn't arrive until June 19, 1865, a full 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Major General Gordon Granger landed in Galveston and read General Order Number 3, informing the enslaved people of Texas that they were free. 2.5 years. Think about that. 2.5 years during which people were held in bondage after the document that was supposed to free them had already been signed, framed, and filed away. The reasons were complicated, involving the remoteness of Texas from the main theaters of war, the limited Union military presence in the state, and the simple, ugly fact that slaveholders in Texas had no intention of sharing news that would cost them their labor force. Some slaveholders had actually relocated to Texas during the war specifically because it was far enough from the fighting that they could hold onto their enslaved workers longer. That day, June 19th, became Juneteenth. Not a celebration of government benevolence, a celebration of the moment freedom finally, belatedly, found the people who'd been kept from it by distance and deliberate silence. And then came the question that nobody was prepared to answer well. 4 million people were legally free. They owned nothing. They had no property, no savings, no formal education that the system had permitted, no legal identity, no political representation, and no reason whatsoever to trust the nation that had enslaved them. They were free in a country that had spent 246 years building every institution, every law, every cultural reflex around the premise that they were something less than fully human. What now? Reconstruction was the attempt to answer, and for a brief, improbable, astonishing moment, the answer looked like it might actually work. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th established citizenship and equal protection under the law. The 15th guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. Black men won election to state legislatures, to the United States Congress, to governorships, to positions of genuine authority throughout the former Confederacy. Public schools were established, many for the first time in southern states that had previously seen no value in educating anyone who wasn't wealthy and white. The Freedmen's Bureau worked to reunite families torn apart by sale, to negotiate labor contracts so that former slaveholders couldn't simply reimpose bondage under a different name, and to provide food, medical care, and legal assistance. Black churches, which had always been the institutional heart of black community life even under slavery, now became powerhouses of political organization, education, mutual aid, and cultural expression. The promise of Reconstruction wasn't just political, it was economic. For a brief time, there was genuine discussion about providing the formerly enslaved with the material basis for real freedom. General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15, issued in January 1865, set aside a strip of coastal land from Charleston, South Carolina, to Jacksonville, Florida, in plots of 40 acres for each freed family. Some families received mules from the Army's surplus stock. 40 acres and a mule. It wasn't just a phrase. It was an actual policy, implemented on the ground, with real people ploughing real land that they believed was now theirs. Approximately 40,000 freed people were settled on this land, and then Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, revoked the order and returned the land to the former slaveholders. Imagine that. You have been freed after a lifetime of slavery. You have been given land. You have begun to build. And then the government takes it back and hands it to the man who used to own you. That betrayal was not symbolic. It was material, and its consequences compounded across every generation that followed. Without land, freed people had limited options. Many entered into sharecropping arrangements with their former enslavers, working the same fields they'd worked as slaves, on terms that were designed to keep them in perpetual debt. The sharecropper provided the labor. The landowner provided the land, the tools, the seed, and the credit to buy provisions at the plantation store, where prices were set by the landowner at whatever markup he pleased. At the end of the season, when the crop was sold, the landowner subtracted the cost of everything he'd provided, and the sharecropper got what was left. What was left was almost always nothing, or worse than nothing, a debt that carried over to the next season, binding the sharecropper to the land as effectively as any chain. It was slavery by another mechanism, and it persisted for generations. Convict leasing was the other system that filled the gap slavery left behind. Southern states passed vagrancy laws, loitering laws, and other statutes specifically designed to criminalize black people for existing in public. A black man walking down a road without proof of employment could be arrested, convicted, fined, and when he couldn't pay the fine, which he couldn't, leased to a private company that would work him in a mine or a turpentine camp or on a railroad under conditions that were sometimes worse than slavery, because the lessee had no financial investment in keeping you alive. You were rented, not owned, which meant that working you to death was cheaper than feeding you properly. The death rates in convict leasing operations were staggering. This system persisted well into the 20th century. It is one of the most underreported atrocities in American history. Despite all of this, despite sharecropping and convict leasing and the Klan and Jim Crow and the constant threat of violence, black communities built. And what they built deserves to be described with the specificity and wonder it merits. All black towns sprang up across the South and the West. Communities founded by freed people who wanted to create spaces where they could govern themselves, educate their children, and live without the constant surveillance and violence of white supremacy. Mound Bayou, Mississippi, founded in 1887 by Isaiah Montgomery, became one of the most prosperous all-black towns in the country, with its own schools, banks, cotton gin, and sawmill. The town had its own newspaper, its own telephone exchange, and a hospital. People who had been born into slavery lived to see their grandchildren elected to town council. Eatonville, Florida, became the first incorporated all-black municipality in the United States, and would later serve as the setting for Zora Neale Hurston's most celebrated work. Nicodemus, Kansas, was founded by formerly enslaved people from Kentucky who traveled west across the plains, seeking the freedom the South refused to provide. They arrived to find nothing but open prairie and an unforgiving climate, and they built a town from the ground up, digging homes out of the sod itself, until they could afford to build with wood. These towns were more than communities. They were experiments in self-determination, living proof that given even the smallest window of opportunity, black Americans could and would build something extraordinary. they were also vulnerable. White resentment of black success was a constant threat, and many all-black towns were undermined over time by railroad companies that bypassed them, state legislatures that defunded them, and neighboring white communities that resented their existence. But the forces aligned against Reconstruction were savage from the very beginning. The Ku Klux Klan, founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, in 1866, existed for one explicit purpose: the annihilation of black political power through organized terror. They burned churches, they burned schools, they assassinated elected officials and community leaders, they whipped, tortured, and murdered voters and organizers. They rode at night, masked and armed, through communities that had just begun to taste what freedom felt like. Local law enforcement was often complicit. State governments were often sympathetic. And gradually, the federal government decided that protecting black citizens from racial terrorism was no longer worth the political investment. The Compromise of 1877 made the betrayal official. In exchange for the presidency, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. Without that military shield, Reconstruction collapsed. Through a combination of Klan violence, electoral fraud, and legal manipulation, Southern states systematically stripped black men of the right to vote. Poll taxes that enslaved people had no money to pay. Literacy tests with questions specifically designed to be unanswerable. Grandfather clauses that exempted white voters from the very requirements created to exclude black ones. White primaries that barred black participation outright. By 1900, in Mississippi, a state where black people constituted the majority of the population, fewer than 9,000 black citizens remained on the voter rolls. Democracy was dismantled in broad daylight, and the rest of the nation looked the other way. Jim Crow settled over the South like a second slavery, different in form, but chillingly similar in function. A comprehensive system of racial segregation that governed every interaction, every space, every breath of daily life. Separate schools that were never anywhere close to equal. Separate hospitals that were underfunded and understaffed. Separate water fountains. Separate entrances to buildings. Separate seating on buses and in theaters. Separate Bibles for oath-taking in courtrooms, because apparently even the Word of God needed to be quarantined. Every boundary was enforced by custom, by law, and by the ever-present threat of violence. Lynching was not rare under Jim Crow. It was a mechanism of social control as deliberate and systematic as any law on the books. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,000 black Americans were murdered by white mobs. These were not clandestine acts committed in shame. They were public spectacles. Entire communities turned out. Photographers set up equipment. Postcards were printed and mailed to friends and relatives, featuring photographs of the dead with handwritten notes on the back, as casual as if they were vacation souvenirs. Children attended, lifted onto their parents' shoulders for a better view. Body parts were taken as keepsakes. The message was clear, precise, and meant to be understood by every black person within earshot, and every black person who would hear about it afterward. Step out of line, and this is what awaits you. The line itself was drawn wherever white authority wanted it on any given day. Looking at a white woman, failing to step off the sidewalk, succeeding too visibly in business, attempting to vote. Any assertion of dignity or equality could be redefined as a transgression worthy of death, with no trial, no evidence, and no consequences for the killers. Ida B. Wells, a black journalist born into slavery in Mississippi, almost single-handedly turned the national spotlight on the epidemic of lynching in the 1890s. She investigated the murders, documented the patterns, and published her findings in pamphlets that dismantled the mythology of the noble white defender protecting Southern womanhood. What she proved, with meticulous reporting, was that lynching had almost nothing to do with crime and everything to do with economic competition and the enforcement of racial hierarchy. A black man who opened a successful business in competition with a white-owned store was in danger. A black community that was visibly prospering was in danger. Lynching was an economic weapon disguised as vigilante justice, and Wells named it for exactly what it was. She was driven from Memphis by death threats for her trouble, but she never stopped writing, and her work laid the groundwork for the anti-lynching movement that would consume decades of organizing. But here is the part of the story that demands equal time, equal weight, and equal wonder. Jim Crow could not kill what it was designed to kill. It could suppress, it could terrorize, it could impoverish and humiliate and murder, but it could not extinguish the drive to build. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood district became Black Wall Street, and walking down its main avenue in 1920 was an experience that defied everything the architects of segregation had intended. 35 blocks of thriving black-owned enterprise. You could start at one end of Greenwood Avenue and get a haircut, buy groceries, eat a hot meal, consult a lawyer, see a doctor, deposit money in a black-owned bank, catch a movie, pick up a newspaper, and stop for ice cream, all without ever entering a white-owned establishment. There were 15 doctors, 2 hospitals, 2 newspapers, a public library, and a bus system. The neighborhood had its own school system, from elementary through high school. There were furriers, jewelers, tailors, and haberdasheries. People drove nice cars. Children played in well-maintained parks. Elderly residents sat on porches and watched a community that they had built from absolutely nothing thrive in ways that weren't supposed to be possible under segregation. In Durham, North Carolina, a similar miracle was unfolding. North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, founded in 1898, became the largest black-owned business in America, anchoring a financial ecosystem that included mechanics and farmers' bank, a black-owned hospital, and a network of businesses that made Durham's Parish Street the Wall, Street of Black America. In every major city across the country, north and south, black communities constructed parallel institutions with ingenuity and determination that turned the enforced separation of Jim Crow into something the segregationists never intended, a space of autonomy and pride. And then white violence came for it, with a fury that defied comprehension. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 leveled Greenwood. It began with an accusation, a young black man allegedly stepping on a white woman's foot in an elevator. Though accounts differ and the truth hardly matters, because the truth was never the point. The point was that Greenwood existed and was thriving, and that its existence was intolerable to people who had been told their entire lives that black success was an impossibility. White mobs, some of them deputized by city officials and given firearms from the National Guard Armory, burned 35 blocks to ash. They poured turpentine on buildings and lit them. They shot residents as they fled their homes. They dropped incendiary devices from private biplanes, making Greenwood the first community in America to be bombed from the air by its own countrymen. Men, women, and children were gunned down in the streets, in their yards, in the ruins of everything they'd built. Estimates of the dead range from the official count of 36, a number nobody believes, to scholarly estimates approaching 300. Bodies were loaded onto trucks and disposed of in locations that remain disputed to this day. 10,000 people were left homeless overnight. Survivors were rounded up and interned, required to carry identification cards before they could move freely in their own city. Insurance claims were systematically denied. Property was seized through legal mechanisms designed to prevent rebuilding. And then Tulsa buried the story so completely that for decades, you couldn't find it mentioned in an Oklahoma history textbook. An entire generation of wealth, community, ingenuity, and pride was erased in a single night, and no one was held accountable. Not then, not for 100 years. Tulsa was not an anomaly. Rosewood, Florida, 1923. The Red Summer of 1919, when racial massacres erupted in more than 24 American cities. East St. Louis, 1917. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898, where an armed white supremacist mob overthrew the elected multiracial city government in what remains the only successful coup d'etat in United States history. Every time Black Americans built something extraordinary, the response could be extraordinary violence, and the system ensured that when that violence came, there would be no compensation, no justice, and often no public record. The Great Migration, that massive movement of 6 million people between 1910 and 1970, reshaped the entire map of Black American life. People boarded trains and packed cars and left behind everything they knew, heading for cities that promised what the South refused to provide: wages, safety, the basic right to vote, and walk the street without terror. They carried with them every cultural treasure they'd forged under slavery and Jim Crow, and those traditions, planted in new urban soil, would blossom into the artistic movements that defined the century. The cultural output of the Great Migration deserves more space than any single script can give it. But let me try to convey even a fraction of its scope. When millions of Black Southerners moved to northern and western cities, they carried cultural traditions that had been forged in slavery and tempered through decades of Jim Crow. And those traditions collided with urban environments in ways that produced some of the most significant artistic movements in the 20th century. The blues, born in the Mississippi Delta, in the cotton fields and juke joints of the rural South, migrated to Chicago's South Side and became electrified, louder, more urgent, more urban. Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Willie, Dixon. They plugged country instruments into amplifiers and created a sound that would directly give birth to rock and roll. Jazz, which had been developing in New Orleans, Congo Square, and Storyville since the late 1800s, traveled upriver and outward to Kansas City, Chicago, and New York, where it evolved into the most sophisticated musical art form America has ever produced. Louis Armstrong in Chicago, Duke Ellington at the Cotton Club, Billie Holiday, whose voice could make a simple lyric feel like the most devastating truth you'd ever heard, Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, reinventing the possibilities of the form itself. This music wasn't entertainment, it was philosophy. It was a way of making sense of the world that honored complexity, improvisation, and the beauty that could be found in the midst of struggle. Gospel music transformed the Black church and, through it, all of American popular music. Thomas Dorsey, the father of gospel music, took the emotional intensity of the blues and married it to sacred lyrics, creating a sound that was simultaneously spiritual and visceral, joyful and grieving, ancient and brand new. From gospel came the vocal traditions that would feed directly into soul, rhythm, and blues, and eventually every genre of popular music that dominates the world today. When you hear the vocal runs in a pop song, when you feel the emotional directness of a soul ballad, when a singer bends a note in a way that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your heart, you are hearing a direct lineage that runs back through gospel churches and blues clubs and plantation quarters to the West African musical traditions that survived the Middle Passage, because the people who carried them refused to let them die. The Harlem Renaissance wasn't just a literary movement, though its literary achievements alone would justify its place in history. Langston Hughes wrote poems that captured the rhythms of black speech and the weight of black experience, with a directness that still startles. Zora Neale Hurston wrote novels that celebrated black Southern life with a warmth and specificity that refused the pressure to make black suffering the only story. Claude McKay wrote sonnets that burned with rage and beauty simultaneously. But the Renaissance was also visual art. Aaron Douglas creating images that blended African aesthetics with modernist technique. It was theatre and dance, an intellectual discourse, and a fundamental insistence that black artistic expression was not a subset of American culture. It was American culture, at its most original and most vital. But the North was not the promised land that the letters home had described. It was different from the South, but it was not equal. Redlining, a practice where federal agencies literally drew red lines on city maps around black neighborhoods and declared them unfit for investment, ensured that black families were confined to specific areas and denied access to the mortgages that were building white suburban wealth. The Federal Housing Administration, the same New Deal program that created the white American middle class, explicitly excluded black applicants. GI Bill benefits were administered through local offices that systematically denied them to black veterans. Social Security initially excluded domestic workers and agricultural laborers, the two largest categories of black employment. The white middle class didn't build itself through hard work alone. It was subsidized into existence by government programs that deliberately shut out black Americans. And the wealth gap that resulted, the gap between what white families accumulated over generations of government-assisted home ownership and what black families were denied, persists to this day. It is not ancient history. It is compound interest. The civil rights movement emerged from all of this, from centuries of resistance that never paused, from the churches that had sustained black community life since slavery, from the women, Joanne Robinson, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, Septima Clark, Dorothy Height, who built and maintained the organizational infrastructure while the cameras focused on the men at the microphones. Rosa Parks was not a tired seamstress who simply sat down. She was a trained NAACP organizer who understood precisely what she was doing, what it would cost, and what it might achieve. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. An entire city's black population walked to work, organized carpools, endured harassment and violence and economic retaliation for more than a year. The sit-in students at lunch counters across the South absorbed ketchup poured on their heads, cigarettes extinguished on their skin, and fists against their faces without retaliating, maintaining a dignity that exposed the ugliness of the system they were challenging. The Freedom Riders boarded buses knowing they would be beaten, and they were. The children of Birmingham marched into the teeth of fire hoses and police dogs in 1963, and they did not turn back. The marchers who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma in 1965 walked into a wall of state troopers armed with clubs and tear gas, and the images that emerged from that day changed the political calculus of the nation. The victories were real, and they were hard won, and they were paid for in blood. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited the discriminatory voting practices that had disenfranchised black Americans for nearly a century, and within months of its passage, black voter registration in the South surged by hundreds of thousands. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, passed in the raw aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, banned discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. These laws did not end racism. They did not close the wealth gap or repair the accumulated damage of centuries of stolen labor, denied education, and confiscated opportunity. They did not compensate a single family for the generations of wealth that had been systematically extracted from them and deposited into the accounts of people who had never picked a single bowl of cotton. But they were the legal acknowledgement, purchased at the highest possible price, that black Americans were full citizens of the nation their ancestors had built with their own hands, their own sweat, and their own blood. That acknowledgement had taken nearly 400 years to arrive, and the work of making it real had barely begun. And then there's everything that came after, the part of the story that is still being written. The war on drugs that imprisoned black men at rates that made Jim Crow look moderate. The gutting of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court in 2013. The wealth gap that persists because you cannot strip a people of everything for 250 years and then declare a level playing field while standing on the mountain of accumulated advantage. The school funding formulas tied to property values that ensure that the neighborhoods redlined into poverty in the 1930s still have the most underfunded schools today. The health disparities, the environmental racism, the ongoing, bitter, necessary argument over whose version of this history gets taught in classrooms and whose gets erased. But also this: black art and music and literature shaping the entire world's culture. Black women as the most educated demographic in America. The tradition of building that began in the quarters and continued through Greenwood and Durham and Harlem and Atlanta and everywhere else, adapting to every new obstacle, answering every attempt at destruction with another act of creation. Here's what I need you to carry with you as you close your eyes tonight. Slavery in America was not a mistake the nation made and corrected. It was not an unfortunate chapter in an otherwise upward story. It was a deliberate system, chosen and reinforced and defended over 250 years by people who knew exactly what they were doing and did it because it made them rich. It was written into the Constitution. It was financed by the banking system. It was blessed from the pulpit. It was argued on the Senate floor. It was the engine that built the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. And when it finally ended, the people who had been enslaved received nothing. No land, no money, no reparations, no apology. Nothing but a piece of paper and a world that was not ready to see them as human. And from that nothing, they built everything. They built communities and churches and schools and universities and businesses. They built music that changed the sound of the planet. They built literature that expanded the boundaries of what language could do. They built movements that bent the arc of the moral universe toward justice. They did all of it while being lynched, while being redlined, while being incarcerated, while being told in every generation and in every possible way that they were less than. They did it anyway. That isn't just resilience. That is the most powerful, the most sustained, the most extraordinary act of creation in the history of this continent. So tonight, as you lie in whatever comfort you found, in a bed with clean sheets and a roof that keeps the rain out, and a door that locks from the inside, whisper a quiet thank you, not to a system that took 2.5 centuries to acknowledge your humanity, not to a government that freed you reluctantly and then walked away, but to the people, the ones who survived the Middle Passage and arrived on foreign shores with nothing but their own heartbeat and the memory of home, the ones who sang in the fields and taught their children letters in the dark, the ones who ran north through swamps and rivers and starlight, the ones who built Greenwood and Durham and Harlem from the ground up, the ones who sat at lunch counters in spotless clothes while hatred was poured over them, the ones who marched across bridges knowing what was waiting on the other side. They carried this story forward, every single generation, so that someone, someday, could tell it whole. They endured what seemed unendurable so that their children's children's children might sleep in warm beds without chains. They ran so that you could rest. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of this story settle over you like a blanket. Not a heavy weight, but a warm one. The weight of knowing that the people who came before you were extraordinary. Not because they were superhuman, because they were deeply, fully, stubbornly, beautifully human in a world that spent every waking moment trying to deny them that humanity. And their courage echoes still, in every fight for justice, in every refusal to accept what is unacceptable, in every voice that rises to say this is who we are, and this is what we survived, and this is what we built from the ruins. Sleep well tonight, and carry their story with you into the morning. Good night.